Hi all, welcome back to my channel Learn with Girish. This is session 2 of the GitOps series wherein we look at a GitOps tool called Flux. In the first session, we looked at what is GitOps and what are some of the benefits of GitOps. I'll share the link of the first session in the description box. You can refer to it in case you are interested. Let's look at today's agenda. So I'll do a quick summary of the first session, and then we'll look at what is Flux, and then we will look at how do we deploy Flux on Azure. There are multiple ways of doing it, and I will discuss both of those. And then we will deploy a working app using Flux. So let's start with a summary of the first session. So we looked at what is GitOps. So you can think of GitOps as a new or a modern way of doing deployments for your apps and infrastructure to Kubernetes cluster, wherein all your deployment files are stored in a declarative style as part of the Git repo. So with GitOps, you would not be logging into your Kubernetes cluster and running kubectl or Helm commands, nor you would do it in your pipelines. Typically, with Kubernetes deployment, you would either do it through Kustomize or Helm. So all those files will be stored in a declarative style as part of the Git. So Git becomes a single source of truth, and any changes to the cluster would be done through Git and not by logging into the Kubernetes cluster. So the question you might have is like how these files which are stored in Git will apply to the Kubernetes cluster. So that's where the GitOps agent comes into picture. So this GitOps agent will look for the files which are stored in your Git repo or any changes that are happening to those files, and the GitOps agent will automatically apply those changes to the Kubernetes cluster. Let's take a look at what is Flux. So it's an open source tool which is part of the CNCF and which has been graduated last year, which means that we can use it in production scenarios. It's created by the people who termed GitOps. It's supported by the major cloud providers, Azure and AWS. And also recently, GitLab announced that it would use Flux as the GitOps tool for deploying to Kubernetes. So Flux conforms to all the GitOps principles, which we saw in our first session. It provides GitOps for both apps and infrastructure. Not only for apps and infrastructure, we can also apply policies to the Kubernetes cluster, thereby ensuring the security of the cluster. It works in the pull mode, wherein you would only do the required changes to your Git repo and then push those changes, and automatically the GitOps agent will pull all those changes and apply to the Kubernetes cluster. It supports for plain YAML, customize, and also Helm releases. It works with the existing tools, like it has support for GitHub, Bitbucket, and also it supports various container registry like Docker Hub, Azure Container Registry, and also it has integrations with the tools like uh, Teams and Slack channel. And also it works very well with the other CNCF tools. So you can think of Flux as a set of controllers, like how Kubernetes have controllers like deployment controller and replica set controller. Like that, it's made up of set of controllers. Let's look at the different type of controllers. First being the source controller. So what this controller does is all your files which you store in your Git repo, right? So those files will be made available to the Kubernetes cluster so that the cluster can work on those files. The next one is the customize controller. So here you can apply your plain YAML files, or you might be doing patching to your YAML files by specifying different values. So with customize, there is this concept of the base file, and then you override with different values. So one example of that would be to have different values for different environment. And then comes the Helm controller, using which you could apply all the Helm artifacts. And then comes the notification controller, wherein you can notify any changes to the above controllers like the source, customize, and Helm controller, uh, to the tools like the Teams channel or the Slack channel. And then comes the last two image controllers. They both work in such a way that whenever you push a container to a container registry, these controllers would pick up the latest version of that container and write back that version to the Git repo. And then the other controllers would pick up that version and apply that version to the Kubernetes cluster. We will look at these image controllers and the workflow associated with them in the upcoming session. Let's take a look at the demo. So in the demo, what I'll be doing is I'll bootstrap Flux. So what it does is it will install Flux, and then it will run few customizations. So the customization, you can think of the different YAML files which you want to apply to the Kubernetes cluster. To understand it better, right, let's take a look at a diagram over here. So installing the Flux component would be the first step, wherein it will install all the controllers which we saw earlier, and then would apply different customizations. So you can think of customizations as the YAML which you want to deploy to your Kubernetes cluster. So instead of applying all the YAMLs together, we can group related YAMLs into different customizations. So here, if you see here, I've grouped all the infra related YAML files uh, to a customization called infra deploy. Likewise, I have done similar for app deploy and post deploy. So once we organize in such a structure, then we can define dependencies between these customization. So for example, we can say that we want to deploy app deploy only once the infra deploy is there. Now let's look at the Git repo. So this is the Git repo which I have opened it in VS Code, and uh, if you come to this folder called clusters, so here we see a folder called Flux system. This is where all the controllers of GitOps are installed using these files. And then we have a YAML file called app customization. So in this, we have defined all the customization as we discussed earlier. So if you see here, we are having an infra deploy customization, which will point to a infra deploy folder, which will contain YAMLs related to infra deployment. And then we would deploy app deploy customization. So this would have dependency on infra deploy. And again, these YAMLs with respect to app deploy will be stored in this particular folder. So likewise, we can create different customizations and then order the execution of those customizations. Let's take a look at the file inside the folders. So let's start with the infra deploy. Here I'm installing Cert Manager and Nginx. So if you look at Cert Manager, um, I have defined a Helm repository over here for the Cert Manager and the namespace demo app. And then I have a Helm release declarative file for Helm installation. And this is the customization where I define these files over here. Likewise, I have Nginx over here. Here I have a namespace.yaml file. This is where we are creating a a namespace called demo app. And again, we have a repository for Nginx and Helm release for Nginx, which is of type load balancer. And I'm also creating a secret which will be used to refer to a Docker container uh, in the container registry. Let's look into the app deploy folder. Here I have only two YAMLs. One is the backend YAML, wherein we are using Redis container, and the other one is the front end app, voting app. So next we will look into the post deploy folder. Here I am creating a certificate using the cert manager, and also have a issuer over here. And then I will configure the ingress, which will point to the front end app. I have created a Kubernetes cluster in Azure, which is an AKS cluster. And if we see here, we have the default namespaces, which comes as part of the cluster. And we do not have any workloads installed specific to our app. Let's install Flux now. So this is the documentation which talks about installing the Flux. And here we have to have a GitHub token, which would help us in creating a repository if the GitHub repository is already not present. And then we specify the path where our Flux component and other customization have to be installed. This is the command which I will be running, which will point to a GitHub, and which will point to the GitHub Bootstrap repository which we saw earlier. And this is where it will install all the Flux controllers. And also I'm installing some of the few additional components with respect to image reflector and image automation. So let's run this command. I'll just copy this command. Here I will be running the Flux command. So it's connecting to GitHub, and then it's all installing all the Flux components, all the controllers under the namespace Flux system namespace. And then it has started reconciling the objects what we have defined in our Git repositories. Let us give some time over here for the reconciliation to happen. So here you would see like all the components are installed properly, and it says all components are healthy. Now let's look at the Flux system namespace. So here it has installed all the controllers like the Helm controller, uh, the customized controller, and the source controller. These are the components which are required to run the Flux. Uh, let's look at the demo app namespace. So if you see here, it has installed the cert manager, the Nginx, and also it has installed our front end and back end app. You can see here some of the containers are still creating. So let's look at the pod over here. Now we see that all our pods are running up and running. Uh, if you see now, all our components are installed fine. And if you see here, uh, we have configured the Nginx to have a load balancer, and it would have this external IP over here. So one thing I haven't done is I haven't configured an external DNS. So one step we have to do manually over here. So I'll copy this IP address. I would go to my domain, and here I might have to change the A record for the app over here. So let me add a new IP address and remove the old one and save it. Now what we can do is we can just check if all our Flux components are synchronized. So for that we can run a command called fluxGitOps. So if you see here, by default, once we run this Flux Bootstrap command, right, a Git repository will be created, which would sync all our files from our Git repo to the Kubernetes cluster. And then we would have different customizations which we had defined in our YAMLs. So if you see here now, the infra deploy customization has already been synced and deployed, and then comes the app deploy, which is also done. So if you see here, the post deploy reconciliation is in progress. Uh, so we have changed the A record to point to the ingress load balancer. It will take some time for the reconciliation. Let's wait for that. After some time, when I ran the flux get all command, right, then I see that the post deploy configuration is done. So what we can do now is we can navigate to that app, and we can see this app uh, being hosted as part of Azure. So we saw that just by running a single command, the Flux Bootstrap command, we were able to configure both our infrastructure and the apps to Azure. There are other ways of applying GitOps agent in Azure. So here I have the AKS cluster, and if you come here, there is an option called as GitOps. So if you go to that option, you would create a GitOps configuration wherein you would provide all the required information. This is a wizard wherein it will take the Git source, and also it will take some customizations, and then you would be able to create this GitOps configuration, which would install all the Flux component as well as apply all the customization which we saw earlier. The same thing can also be done using Azure CLI commands by running Azure Gates configuration create. We can also use this one. So one of the commands I have used over here. So we can create a similar configuration as that of the Flux Bootstrap. So here I have mentioned the namespace, the cluster to deploy on. This is the Git repo, and then we can specify different customization, and also we can specify the depends on properties which we saw earlier in the session. So these are different ways which we can apply GitOps agent on Azure. Let's summarize what are the things we saw in this session. So we looked at what is Flux, and then we looked at how do we deploy apps and infrastructure using Flux, and also we looked at different ways of using the Flux agent in Azure AKS cluster. So in the next session, I will cover more on the image reflector and the image automation controller. wherein we will see the workflow of how do we push a container to a container repository and deploy the same to a Kubernetes cluster. Thanks for watching this session and stay tuned for more videos like this. Thank you.